Push forward! I've got you covered!
Stay close, they're everywhere.
Copy that! Keep them off us!
Almost there.
The wind did not howl on Tartarus 9. It screamed. It sounded like rusted metal grinding against bone, a relentless shriek that stripped the warmth from a man's lungs the second he stepped outside. Harlan Vance leaned into the gale, pulling the collar of his grease-stained parka tight against his jaw. At 62, his joints predicted the ice storms better than the colony's million-dollar weather array. Tonight, his knees burned like dry ice and the knuckles of his right hand throbbed with a dull, familiar ache. He carried a heavy tungsten wrench in his left hand. His right hand stayed buried deep in his pocket. It was better when he didn't look at the tremor. He was 2 miles out from Outpost Echo, dragging his boots through knee-deep drifts to check a frozen pressure valve on the perimeter thermal drill. It was grunt work for a younger man, but Harlan preferred the punishing cold to the deafening silence of his empty bunkhouse. The cold was honest. It just wanted to kill you. It didn't haunt you. Through the blinding curtain of white, a flash of unnerving color caught his eye. Not the dull gray of the outpost steel, not the blinding white of the storm. It was a deep, impossible crimson smeared across a jagged ridge of blue ice. Blood. And a lot of it. Harlan stopped. The mechanic in him, the man who just wanted to fix broken pipes and be left alone, told him to turn back. Call it in. Let the corporate security boys handle it. But the ghost in his chest, the old soldier who had never truly unlaced his combat boots, locked his jaw. He dropped the wrench. His right hand came out of his pocket, pulling the heavy snub-nosed plasma revolver from his hip holster. The moment the cold air hit his skin, the shaking began. The barrel of the gun danced in the wind, a pathetic rhythmic tremor that traveled from his scarred forearm down to his fingertips. He gripped his right wrist with his left hand, forcing the weapon steady, and moved toward the ridge. The smell hit him before the sight did. Ozone, burnt flesh, and the sharp metallic tang of discharged energy weapons. It was an ambush site. 3 bodies lay half buried in the snow. Human mercenaries. Corporate wet-work operators by the look of their unmarked tactical gear. They were dead, torn apart with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. Beyond them, slumped against the base of the ice wall, was the survivor. Harlan tightened his grip on the revolver. She was a Cryon, the native species of this frozen hell. They were myths to most of the rig workers, ghosts in the ice, who occasionally raided supply lines. Harlan had never been this close to one. She was tall, even slouched against the ice with limbs corded in lean, dense muscle. Her skin was a deep, bruised indigo mottled with a dusting of frost. A heavy combat harness slashed to ribbons clung to her chest. A deep plasma burn scored across her ribs, leaking thick, dark blue blood that froze the moment it hit the air. Her silver hair was matted to her face, but her eyes were open. They were a piercing, luminous silver, staring down the trembling barrel of Harlan's gun. She didn't reach for the shattered, crystalline blade lying in the snow a few feet away. She didn't bare her teeth. She just looked at him, and then slowly she forced herself onto her knees. The movement was agonizing. Harlan could hear the ice cracking on her suit. She knelt before him in the bloody snow, her head tilted slightly back, exposing the long, vulnerable column of her throat. Harlan's breath hitched. His finger hovered over the trigger. Shoot, the old training whispered. She's the enemy. She's a killer. But the tremor in his hand worsened. The wind seemed to fade, replaced by the echo of a different storm 30 years gone. A dusty canyon, a pinned-down squad. A kid named Miller, barely 19, looking at Harlan with terrified eyes. Harlan had the shot. He had the sniper in his sights, but he looked at the enemy's face, a kid no older than Miller, and for 3 seconds, his finger froze. 3 seconds of hesitation. That was all it took. The sniper fired first. Miller's chest exploded. The backdraft caught Harlan in the neck, leaving a jagged, crawling web of burn scars that throbbed every time the nightmares came. He had hesitated then. Now staring at this bleeding, defeated woman in the snow, the paralysis gripped him again. "Don't kill me, human." Her voice cut through the howling wind. It was not a growl. It was melodic, resonant, carrying a strange metallic harmonic. She didn't sound afraid. She sounded utterly exhausted. She held his gaze, her silver eyes unblinking. "I will warm your bed." The words hung in the freezing air. Harlan stared at her, the sheer absurdity of the statement short-circuiting his battle-worn instincts. A fierce apex predator of the ice wastes, offering herself in the most degrading human terms imaginable. But there was no seduction in her voice, only a cold, pragmatic transaction. The ancient law of a conquered warrior offering the ultimate surrender to stay alive. Harlan looked at her bleeding side. He looked at his own trembling, scarred hand. Slowly, deliberately, he engaged the safety. The click was loud in the silence between the gusts of wind. He holstered the gun. He didn't say a word. He reached into his heavy parka, pulled out a military-grade thermal foil blanket, and tossed it. It landed in the snow at her knees. He reached into his other pocket, pulled out a self-heating ration tin of beef stew, cracked the seal so the steam hissed into the air, and set it on the ice. Then he turned his back on the deadliest creature on Tartarus 9, picked up his tungsten wrench, and started walking back to his track rover. He took 5 steps before he heard the crunch of boots in the snow behind him. He didn't look back. He just lowered the rover's cargo ramp. The ride back to Outpost Echo was silent. Harlan kept the cabin heat blasted to maximum. From the corner of his eye, he watched her. She sat rigidly in the passenger seat, wrapped in the foil, staring out the reinforced glass. Her indigo skin was flushed with a darker purplish hue. She was sweating. Cryons were built for sub-zero temperatures. To her, the cabin was a furnace. But she endured it without a word, her jaw set clutching the empty ration tin like a lifeline. Harlan lived in a detached maintenance shed on the edge of the outpost perimeter. It was off the grid, buried under a snowbank, smelling permanently of motor oil, oxidized metal, and stale coffee. It was a mess of disassembled engine blocks and rusted tools. It was his sanctuary. He led her inside, locking the heavy steel door behind them. He pointed to a pile of clean canvas tarps near the corner. "Sit," he rasped. His voice sounded like grinding gravel. He hadn't spoken to another living soul in 4 days. She sat. She watched him with those luminous, silver eyes tracking every movement. Harlan didn't sleep that night. He didn't even take off his boots. He dragged a faulty generator block onto his workbench, clamped it down in the vise, and went to work. The rhythmic clinking of his ratchet, the scrape of wire brushes against carbon buildup, the hiss of degreaser. He worked with his back to her, but he was acutely aware of every breath she took. He was waiting for her to make a move, to find a sharp piece of scrap and put it through his neck. But the attack never came. Around 0300 hours, the rhythm of her breathing changed. She had curled into a tight ball on the tarps, the foil blanket pulled over her head. She was asleep. Harlan stopped wrenching. He leaned heavily against the workbench, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked at his right hand. It was steady now. It only shook when he held a weapon. It only shook when life and death were on the line. With a wrench, he was safe. He looked at the sleeping alien. He had brought the war into his home. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely dead inside. The morning brought no dawn, only a slightly lighter shade of gray beyond the frosted skylight. Harlan was under a massive half-ton hydraulic drill press struggling to align the mounting brackets. He was lying on a creeper, his left arm straining, his right hand slipping on the grease-slicked steel. His shoulder popped a sharp spike of pain shooting down his collarbone. He gritted his teeth, refusing to make a sound. The bracket slipped. The heavy steel shaft began to drop. It would crush his ribs. Before he could roll away, a pair of indigo hands gripped the steel shaft. Harlan froze. Above him, Zalith stood over the machine. Her combat harness was gone, replaced by an oversized, grease-stained flannel shirt she had found on a hook. The fabric hung loose over her scarred, muscular frame. She didn't strain. She didn't grunt. With a terrifying, fluid grace, she lifted the 500-pound steel shaft as if it were made of balsa wood, holding it perfectly steady. She looked down at him, her face expressionless. Harlan stared at her for a long second. Then he grabbed his torque wrench, slid the bracket into place, and bolted it down tight. "Clear," he grunted. She let go. The machine settled with a heavy thud. Harlan rolled out from under the press and stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the massive piece of machinery, then at the cryon woman. There was no thank you. There didn't need to be. It was the silent language of labor understood by anyone who knew the value of a hard day's work. He walked over to a scrap bin, dug through a pile of discarded circuitry, and pulled out a broken heating coil from an old rover cabin. He tossed it onto the workbench and grabbed his soldering iron. For the next 20 minutes, she watched him work. He stripped the wires, rerouted the microboard, and attached a small leather strap he cut from an old tool belt. He walked over to her and held it out. It was a makeshift thermal regulator. "Put it on your wrist," Harlan said. "It pulls the ambient heat away from your skin, keeps your core temperature down. The ambient heat in here will kill you otherwise." Zaylith looked at the crude device, then at his face. She took it, snapping the leather strap around her thick wrist. Almost instantly, the dark purple flush began to fade from her cheeks, returning to her natural bruised indigo. A long, slow exhale escaped her lips. "Thank you," she said softly. Harlan turned away, suddenly uncomfortable with the gratitude. He walked over to the grimy coffee percolator sitting on a milk crate. The liquid inside had been brewing since yesterday. It looked like crude oil and smelled like burnt pennies. He poured 2 chipped ceramic mugs, walked back and handed her one. "Drink," he said. "It's awful, but it keeps you moving." Zaylith wrapped her large hands around the mug. She brought it to her nose and sniffed. Her silver eyes narrowed slightly. But ever the disciplined warrior honoring her host, she took a generous, unhesitating gulp. The reaction was instantaneous. Her eyes went wide. Her jaw locked. The muscles in her neck corded as she forced herself to swallow the bitter, sludgy liquid. Her stoic, fearsome warrior facade completely shattered, replaced by a look of profound, visceral betrayal. She coughed, holding the mug away from her as if it were a live grenade. "By the ancestors," she choked out, her melodic voice rasping. "Is this a weapon?" Harlan stopped with his mug halfway to his lips. He looked at her horrified expression. He looked at his own mug. A low rumble started in his chest. It vibrated up his throat, unfamiliar and strange. His lips twitched. The corners of his mouth pulled upward. And then Harlan laughed. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a deep, gravelly bark of genuine amusement. It was the laugh of a man who had forgotten how to make the sound. The sheer absurdity of the moment, a legendary Cryon killer, a creature that could rip a man in half with her bare hands, nearly brought to her knees by a cup of bad coffee. Zaylith stared at him. The sound of his laughter seemed to startle her more than a gunshot would have. She watched the deep lines around his eyes crinkle, watched the heavy burden of his posture lift for just a fraction of a second. Slowly, the tension bled out of her own shoulders. The corners of her blue lips curled up in a faint, cautious smile. "I have survived plasma fire, human," she said, her voice dry. "But I do not think I will survive your hospitality." "Name's Harlan," he said, taking a sip of the battery acid, "and you don't have to drink it." "I am Zaylith," she replied, setting the mug down on the workbench with deliberate care. "And I will fight my own wars, Harlan. Not this one." The silence that followed wasn't heavy with tension anymore. It was comfortable. It was the quiet of 2 strays finding a dry spot out of the rain. Harlan went back to his workbench. He picked up a delicate micro-caliper to measure a fuel injector. But the moment his fingers pinched the metal tool, the tremor returned. It was subtle at first, just a slight vibration. But as he tried to focus, the shaking intensified. The caliper clattered against the steel table. He cursed under his breath, gripping his right wrist with his left hand, his jaw clenching in frustration. He closed his eyes, waiting for the ghost to pass. He didn't hear her approach. He only felt a sudden, shocking drop in temperature next to him. Zaylith stood at his side. She looked down at his trembling hand. Then her gaze moved up, settling on the jagged, twisting scars that peeked out from the collar of his shirt, creeping up the side of his neck. "A plasma burn," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Harlan pulled his hand away, turning his face to hide the worst of the scar tissue. "Old accident. Doesn't matter. Nerve damage does not cause that kind of tremor," Zaylith said, her voice gentle but unyielding. "That is the tremor of a mind fighting its own memory." Harlan's chest tightened. He wanted to yell at her to back off. He wanted to throw her out into the cold. But he looked into her silver eyes and he saw a mirror. He saw a soul carrying a body count it couldn't wash off. 3 seconds. Harlan whispered the words tearing out of his throat before he could stop them. He stared blindly at the rusted wall. "I had the shot. The enemy sniper was right in my crosshairs. But he looked like a kid. Just a scared kid." I hesitated for 3 seconds. His hands gripped the edge of the workbench until his knuckles turned white. "My point man was named Miller. He was 19. In those 3 seconds, the sniper fired. Miller took it in the chest. The backdraft caught me. He touched his scarred neck, his breathing ragged. I let a good man die because I didn't have the stomach to pull the trigger when it mattered. Every time I touch a weapon now, my hands remember. The heavy silence returned. Harlan waited for the judgment. He waited for the Cryon warrior, a creature bred for ruthless efficiency, to look at him with disgust, to see him for the broken coward he was. Instead, a cold sensation pressed against the burning skin of his neck. Harlan gasped. Zalith had reached out. Her large indigo fingers, freezing to the touch, rested gently against his plasma scars. The relief was instantaneous. The scars always burned, a dull phantom fire that never truly went away. But her touch, the deep Arctic cold of her biology, soothed the fire in a way no medical salve ever had. Harlan froze, afraid to move, afraid to break the contact. When you found me in the snow, Zayla spoke, her voice a soft hum vibrating in the quiet room. You held a weapon. You pointed it at my heart. Harlan swallowed hard. I did. Did your hands shake then? Yes. Zayla's thumb lightly traced the edge of his scar. Because you are a killer, Harlan, or because you are a protector who was forced to kill. Harlan didn't have an answer. You did not hesitate to spare me. Zalith continued, her silver eyes locking onto his. You did not hesitate to bring me into your sanctuary. You did not hesitate to give me your warmth when my body was failing. A coward hides behind his weapon. A warrior knows when to put it down. She slowly withdrew her hand. The phantom heat immediately returned to Harlan's neck, but the tightness in his chest had shattered. I offered to warm your bed. Zayla said, her tone shifting, carrying a weight of solemn tradition. You believed it was a surrender of the flesh, a slave's bargain. Harlan looked down. It's what it sounded like. My people are born of the ice, she explained, looking out the frosted skylight at the raging storm. We do not generate our own heat. To survive the long dark, we must share core warmth. To offer one's body to another in the cold. It is not subjugation. It is the highest form of trust. It means saying, I will keep your heart beating, and you will keep mine. She looked back at him. My father, the general of the northern tribes, sold my unit to the human mercenaries. He sent me to die because I spoke against his endless war. He betrayed my trust. She stepped closer to Harlan. You, a stranger, an enemy, gave me yours. Before Harlan could process the weight of her revelation that she was royalty betrayed by her own blood, a loud metallic clang echoed through the shed. The overhead lights flickered, buzzed violently, and died. The heavy rhythmic thrum of the main generator, a sound so constant, Harlan had stopped hearing, it ground to a sickening halt. Total darkness swallowed the room. Harlan immediately reached into his pocket and clicked on a small tactical flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the breath vapor already pluming from his lips. The primary coil just blew, Harlan said, his voice tight. He aimed the light at the digital thermostat on the wall. The red numbers were already dropping rapidly. -10, -15. Without the generator, the shed was nothing but a tin can sitting on a glacier. I need to fix it, Harlan said, moving toward his tool chest. How long? Zalith asked. Hours, maybe more if the manifold is cracked. Harlan grabbed a heavy wrench, his hands perfectly steady now. The crisis had pushed the ghost away. Put the foil blanket back on. Keep moving. He worked furiously in the tight beam of the flashlight. The temperature plummeted. -30. The moisture in the air began to crystallize, falling like diamond dust inside the room. Harlan's fingers went numb. He dropped a bolt, swearing as he fumbled to pick it up with stiffening joints. -45. Harlan's breath came in ragged, painful gasps. His parka wasn't enough without the ambient heat of the generator. He felt the insidious, sleepy pull of hypothermia creeping into his brain. He forced himself to turn the wrench. Just one more bolt. A heavy hand clamped onto his shoulder. He dropped the wrench and looked up. Zayla stood there. She had taken off the thermal regulator he built for her. Her skin was pale, almost gray. The cold was affecting her too, but she was designed for it. Harlan was not. His lips were blue. He was shivering so violently his teeth clattered. Stop, she commanded. Gotta fix the manifold. Harlan slurred, trying to turn back to the machine. Zalith didn't argue. She grabbed him by the front of his parka, hauled him effortlessly to his feet, and dragged him toward the corner of the room where the heavy canvas tarps lay. Harlan tried to resist, but his limbs felt like lead. He collapsed onto the tarps. Zaelith knelt beside him. She stripped off her heavy flannel shirt. Underneath, she wore a form-fitting sleeveless undersuit. She pulled the thick canvas tarps and the foil blanket over both of them, creating a dark enclosed cocoon. Then she pulled Harlan against her chest. Harlan gasped. Her skin was freezing, but her core deep beneath the muscle and bone radiated a strange, dense, stabilizing thermal mass. It wasn't hot. It was just absolute. "Listen to my heart," Zaelith whispered in the dark, her chin resting on the top of his head. Her arms wrapped around his shivering frame, locking him in a vice-like grip of protection. Harlan pressed his ear against her chest. The heartbeat was slow, painfully slow. Thump, thump. "Breathe with it," she instructed. Harlan closed his eyes. The pain in his joints, the burning in his scars, the freezing agony in his fingers, it all began to narrow down to the slow, steady rhythm of her heart. He felt his own frantic, terrified pulse begin to slow down, matching her ancient glacial pace. He was a broken old man, an outcast, hiding from his failures. She was a betrayed queen hunted by her own kind. Beneath the canvas in the deadly cold of Tartarus 9, they shared the only thing they had left. "I see you, Harlan," she whispered into the darkness. Harlan stopped shivering. He closed his eyes, his breathing finally deepening into a steady rhythm. His scarred, calloused hand reached up weakly, grasping the thick fabric of her undersuit, holding on. "I see you too, Zaelith," he breathed. Outside, the storm screamed against the steel walls, but inside the cocoon, the cold could no longer reach him. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of the main generator vibrated through the steel floorboards. Harlan sat at his workbench, staring blindly at the frost melting on the skylight. It was morning, or whatever passed for it on Tartarus 9. The storm had broken. A pale, bruised light filtered into the shed, illuminating the floating dust and the sharp exhale of his own breath. His bones ached with a deep, resonant cold, but he was alive. He looked toward the corner of the room. The canvas tarps were neatly folded. Zaelith stood by the heavy steel door, staring out through the reinforced viewport. In the dim light, her indigo skin looked almost black, her silver hair catching the faint illumination. She stood perfectly still, a statue carved from the ice of her homeworld. She had kept his heart beating. He had kept hers from freezing. In the brutal mathematics of the frontier, a debt like that bound two souls tighter than blood. Harlan picked up a rag and began wiping the grease from his hands. As he reached for a wrench, his knuckles brushed against something cold and smooth. He paused. He pulled the rag away. Nestled between a rusted socket set and a spool of copper wire lay a device. It was sleek, angular, and made of a dark, matte composite that absorbed the light. It was no bigger than a matchbox, but Harlan recognized military-grade hardware when he saw it. He picked it up. It hummed faintly against his palm. A tiny, recessed light blinked a slow, steady crimson. It was a long-range communication relay, Cryon design. But the serial number laser-etched into the casing wasn't alien. It was standard corporate alphanumeric. Harlan's thumb ran over the small stamped logo. 2 interlocking gears, Sterling Dynamics. The private military corporation contracted to secure the Tartarus 9 mining sectors. He didn't speak. He just turned around and dropped the device onto the metal table with a sharp clack. Zaelith turned from the window. She looked at the relay, then at Harlan. Her silver eyes didn't flinch. She didn't feign ignorance. "You're a long way from a corporate boardroom," Harlan said. His voice was flat. The gravel in his throat felt heavier than usual. "And Sterling Dynamics doesn't issue encrypted relays to local raiders." Zaelith walked slowly toward the workbench. She stopped a few feet away, her tall frame casting a long shadow over his tools. "It is a tracking beacon," she said. Her melodic voice was stripped of its usual commanding resonance. It sounded tired, modified to punch through the ion storms. Harlan leaned back against the heavy drill press, crossing his arms over his chest. "You led them here." "I did not activate it." She pointed a long, scarred finger at the device. "It was activated remotely when my vital signs stabilized. When you saved me." Harlan let out a slow, bitter breath. He had spent 10 years trying to vanish, trying to become a ghost in a machine shop. And now the war had found his front door. "Who are you, Zalith?" he asked. The question wasn't a demand, it was a plea for the truth. Corporate mercs don't hunt grunts with that kind of tech. They hunt high-value targets. She looked down at her hands, hands that had snapped bones and wielded blades now resting quietly against her sides. "I am the first daughter of the Northern Ascendancy," she said softly. "The rightful heir to the Ice Thrones." Harlan closed his eyes. A queen. He had dragged a runaway alien queen into his rusted shed. "My father is General Vale," she continued, her voice gaining a hard, brittle edge. "He has waged war against your kind for a decade. He tells our people it is a war for survival, a war to reclaim our hunting grounds." She looked up, her eyes locking onto Harlan's. "It is a lie." Harlan opened his eyes. He knew the look of a soldier who had discovered the brass was corrupt. It was a universal expression transcending species. "Beneath the deep ice," Zalith said, stepping closer. "Beneath the corporate mining grids, there is a core. Ancient technology, left by those who walked this world before my ancestors crawled from the frost. It radiates raw, limitless energy." "Sterling dynamics," Harlan muttered, piecing the puzzle together. "Yes, Colonel Sterling found it, but he could not excavate it without breaking the colonial treaties. He needed a distraction. He needed a war." Zalith's jaw tightened. "So he made a pact with my father. Sterling provides the weapons. My father provides the bloodshed. While our people will slaughter each other and on the surface, their machines dig in the dark." The sheer suffocating weight of the betrayal settled over the room. Harlan thought of the young rig workers he had seen shipped back in body bags. He thought of the cryon bodies burned in the snow. All of it. A smokescreen for corporate greed and royal ambition. "I found the staging ground," Zalith said. "I gathered the proof. I was returning to the High Council to expose my father." She touched the deep bandaged plasma burn on her ribs. "He did not send the human mercenaries to capture me, Harlan. He sent them to silence me. And Colonel Sterling was more than happy to oblige." Harlan looked at the blinking red light of the tracker. Beep, beep, beep. It was pulsing faster now. He didn't ask her why she didn't tell him sooner. He knew why. Trust was a commodity rarer than clean water on this rock. She had waited to see if the old human would sell her out. She had waited to see if his warmth was real. Harlan turned away from her. He walked to the far end of the shed where a heavy reinforced steel locker stood bolted to the concrete floor. He hadn't opened it in 5 years. He punched in a 9-digit code. The heavy bolts retracted with a solid thunk. He pulled the door open. Inside, smelling of gun oil and preservation grease, was his past. A heavy custom-board plasma repeater, bandoliers of high-explosive slugs, thermal grenades, and his old tactical rig, the armor plating scarred from the firefight that had taken Miller's life. Harlan reached out. His right hand hovered over the cold steel of the repeater. He waited for the tremor. He waited for the phantom pain, the suffocating panic, the ghost of the 19-year-old kid to scream in his ear. He stared at his hand. It was perfectly, utterly still. The ghost was gone. It had been frozen out in the dark, chased away by the slow, steady heartbeat of the woman standing behind him. For the first time in a decade, Harlan wasn't holding a weapon out of duty or orders or fear. He was holding it to protect his home. He lifted the heavy rifle. He racked the charging handle. The whine of the plasma coils spinning up sounded like a predator waking from a long sleep. He turned back to Zalith. He tossed her a heavy industrial plasma cutter. It wasn't a sword, but in the hands of a cryon, it would cut through armor just as well. "They aren't coming to negotiate," Harlan said, strapping the armored rig over his flannel shirt. Zalith caught the heavy tool effortlessly. She looked at the hardened edge in his eyes. The broken old mechanic was gone. The veteran had returned. "Colonel Sterling will lead them," she said. "He does not leave loose ends." "Good," Harlan grunted. He grabbed a pair of magnetic proximity mines from the locker and walked toward the shed door. "Saves me the trip to his office." A low mechanical rumble began to vibrate through the concrete floor. It wasn't the storm. It was the sound of heavy treads crushing the ice. Harlan moved to the viewport. 3 miles out, cresting the glacial ridge, a convoy appeared. 2 heavy corporate assault rovers painted matte black. Flanking them were 4 cryon war skiffs, their sleek, jagged hulls gliding silently over the snow. Human and alien united in a conspiracy of silence, coming to bury their mistakes. Harlan felt a cold, pristine focus settle over his mind. He didn't see an overwhelming force. He saw a mechanical problem, and Harlan Vance knew how to take things apart. "We don't hold the walls," Harlan said, moving rapidly around the shop. He grabbed a heavy chain and wrapped it around the main pressurized coolant tank. "They have vehicle-mounted railguns. They'll punch through this tin can in 3 seconds. We let them breach. We draw them into the killing floor." Zayleth watched him work, her silver eyes tracking his precise, calculated movements. "You are turning your sanctuary into a trap." "It's just metal," Harlan said. He rigged a tripwire to the coolant valve and backed away. "Metal can be replaced." He looked at her. "You stand behind the hydraulic press. When the door blows, the thermals will blind their optics for about 4 seconds. You take the left flank, I take the right. You don't stop moving until they stop breathing. Understand?" Zayleth ignited the plasma cutter. A blade of searing blue energy roared to life, casting harsh shadows across her bruised face. She spun the heavy tool in a practiced, deadly arc, the hum of the plasma synchronizing with the deep rumble in her chest. "I am the Ice Throne," she said, her voice dropping an octave, resonating with ancient authority. "I do not yield." Harlan racked a high-explosive slug into the chamber of his Magnum revolver and holstered it. He raised the plasma repeater. "Neither do I." The rumble outside turned into a deafening roar. The assault rovers had encircled the shed. Brilliant, blinding halogen spotlights pierced the frosted windows, throwing long, stark beams of light across the scattered tools and oil stains. A voice boomed through an external loudspeaker. It was crisp, educated, and utterly devoid of empathy. "Colonel Sterling, Harlan Vance, serial number 84-Bravo-9er. We know she's in there. You have an honorable service record, Sergeant. Step outside, hands empty. This doesn't have to be your funeral." Harlan didn't answer. He stood behind a stack of rusted engine blocks, his breathing shallow and controlled. He aimed his rifle at the center of the heavy steel door. 5 seconds, Sergeant," Sterling's voice echoed. Harlan looked across the room. Zayleth was crouched behind the massive iron frame of the drill press, her muscles coiled like heavy springs. The blue light of the cutter painting her skin in a deadly hue. She met his gaze. She nodded once. "Breach." The explosion was catastrophic. The heavy steel door didn't just open, it vaporized. A shaped breaching charge blew the reinforced metal inwards, sending a shower of shrapnel and white-hot slag tearing through the shed. The concussion knocked tools off the walls and shattered the skylight. A wall of freezing air rushed in, colliding with the ambient heat of the shed, instantly creating a thick, blinding fog of condensation. Just as Harlan predicted, 6 tactical operatives poured through the breach, their thermal goggles glowing a dull insectoid red in the fog. They moved with professional precision, sweeping their rifles. They never saw the tripwire. The lead operative hit the wire. The coolant tank's valve sheared off. A jet of hyper-pressurized sub-zero liquid nitrogen screamed into the room. It hit the 3 men on the right flank. Their armor froze solid instantly. They dropped to the floor, gasping as the air in their lungs crystallized. Harlan stepped out from cover. He squeezed the trigger. The plasma repeater barked a staccato rhythm of pure violence. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, but his hands were steady. So steady. 3 bolts of searing energy punched through the bomb, hitting the remaining operative's center mass. Their kinetic armor flashed bright white before failing. They went down hard. "Left flank!" Harlan roared over the deafening hiss of the coolant. Through the fog, a massive shadow moved. 3 Cryon warriors wielding jagged kinetic pikes leaped through the breach. They were massive, bred for close-quarters slaughter. Zayleth met them in the air. She didn't use firearms. She was a force of nature. She swung the heavy industrial plasma cutter like a broadsword. The blue blade cleaved through the first warrior's pike, melting the alloy instantly, and continued its arc into his chest plate. He fell backward into the snow. The second warrior lunged, thrusting his pike at her throat. Zayleth sidestepped with terrifying speed. She grabbed the shaft of the weapon, her indigo hands crushing the carbon fiber. She pulled the warrior forward, driving her knee upward with the force of a hydraulic piston. The crack of armor and bone echoed sharply. The third warrior hesitated. He recognized her. He saw the silver eyes of his rightful queen. In that fraction of a second, the conditioning of his rank battled with the loyalty of his blood. Zaelith didn't hesitate. She drove the hilt of her weapon into his temple, knocking him unconscious. She would not kill her own people if she didn't have to. "Movement outside," Harlan shouted, ejecting a spent thermal cell and slapping a fresh one into the repeater. The fog began to clear, pulled out by the howling storm. Beyond the smoking crater of the doorway, standing in the glare of the rover headlights, was Colonel Sterling. He wore an immaculate, tailored hazard suit. Beside him stood a Creon of immense proportions, adorned in heavy spiked ceremonial armor. General Vale, Zaelith's father. Sterling raised a heavy-scoped hand cannon. He didn't aim at Zaelith, he aimed at Harlan. "Kill the mechanic," Sterling ordered casually. "Subdue the girl." General Vale raised a hand. The turret on the second rover whined as its targeting laser cut through the falling snow, painting a red dot directly on Harlan's chest. "Move!" Zaelith screamed. Harlan dove sideways. The rover's railgun fired. The sound was a supersonic crack that shattered every remaining piece of glass in the shed. A depleted uranium slug moving at Mach 4 tore through the rusted steel wall where Harlan had been standing a microsecond before. It obliterated the engine blocks, sending massive chunks of iron flying like shrapnel. Harlan hit the ground hard. Pain flared in his side. A jagged piece of iron had caught him just above the hips, slicing through the armor plating and burying itself deep into his muscle. He gritted his teeth, swallowing the scream. He rolled behind the remains of his workbench, pressing a hand to his side. His gloves came away slick, with dark, hot blood. "Harlan," Zaelith abandoned her cover. She sprinted across the killing floor, ignoring the kinetic rounds sparking off the concrete at her feet. She slid behind the workbench, grabbing his shoulders. Her silver eyes widened as she saw the blood pooling on the floor. "You are hit," she said, her voice tight with a sudden raw panic that she had never shown in battle. "I'm fine." Harlan lied, his breathing turning shallow. He pulled his Magnum revolver from its holster. The heavy repeater was out of reach. "I can't walk, Zay. The hip is shattered." The rover's railgun whined again. It was charging for a second shot. This one would level the entire shed. Harlan grabbed her arm. His grip was remarkably strong. "Listen to me," he rasped, coughing. A fine mist of blood sprayed his lips. "The exhaust port in the back. It leads to the subterranean maintenance tunnels. They don't know it's there. You can fit." "I'm not leaving you," she snarled, grabbing the heavy canvas tarp to staunch the bleeding. "You have to be," Harlan yelled, the gravel in his voice cracking. "Sterling wants the core. Your father wants a throne built on lies. You are the only one who can stop them. You have the proof." He shoved the encrypted relay into her hand. "Get to the comms tower at Sector 4. Broadcast the data. Break the treaty." Harlan pushed her back. "I'll detonate the fuel reserves. It'll buy you 10 minutes. Zaelith looked at the old man. She saw the blood. She saw the resolve. She saw a human who had already given up his life, ready to trade it for hers. "A coward hides behind his weapon," she whispered, repeating her own words to him. Harlan offered a bloody grim smile. "I'm not hiding. I'm just covering the retreat." The whine of the railgun reached a high-pitched crescendo. Zaelith didn't run for the exhaust port. She didn't take the relay. She dropped the device onto the floor and crushed it beneath her heavy boot. The red blinking light died instantly. Harlan stared at her in shock. "What did you do?" "I chose," she said. She reached down, grabbed Harlan by the straps of his tactical harness, and hauled him to his feet. He cried out in pain, his weight sagging against her. She wrapped his left arm around her neck and clamped her massive arm around his waist, taking his entire weight. "Where your warmth is, my tribe is," Zaelith said, her voice echoing over the hum of the deadly weapon outside. She looked him dead in the eyes, stripping away titles, crowns, and treaties. "I see you, Harlan, and I do not leave my people behind." She didn't run away from the door. She dragged him toward it. "Hold on," she commanded. She raised the plasma cutter, but she didn't aim it at the soldiers outside. She aimed it straight down at the concrete floor directly over the primary geothermal heating conduit Harlan had showed her on her first night. She drove the blade into the ground. The superheated plasma bit into the high-pressure steam line. "Brace!" Harlan yelled. The geyser erupted. Millions of gallons of pressurized boiling steam trapped beneath the permafrost exploded upward. The concrete floor shattered like glass. A massive pillar of blinding white vapor shot 50 feet into the air, completely engulfing the shed, the rovers and the soldiers in an impenetrable scalding cloud. The railgun fired blindly, the slug tearing harmlessly into the sky. In the chaos and the deafening roar of the escaping Earth, Zalith carried the broken mechanic into the blinding white. They disappeared into the storm, leaving the Queen's crown and the soldier's ghost burning in the wreckage behind them. The subterranean maintenance tunnels beneath Outpost Echo smelled of sulfur, stagnant water, and ancient crushing pressure. They were never meant for human foot traffic. They were jagged, unlit arteries carved into the permafrost to vent the colony's excess geothermal runoff. Right now, they were the only thing keeping Harlan Vance and Zalith alive. Zalith moved through the pitch-black corridor with a terrifying silent grace, her boots splashing softly in the ankle-deep freezing water. She carried Harlan. She didn't drag him. She carried him over her broad shoulders like a wounded comrade on a battlefield, her massive strength ignoring the dead weight of his armored rig. Harlan's world had narrowed to a tunnel of agonizing pain. The depleted uranium of shrapnel was lodged deep in his right hip. Every step Zalith took sent a blinding spike of white-hot agony up his spine. His vision swam in the dark. His breathing was wet and ragged, echoing off the cramped, icy walls. He clamped his jaw shut until his teeth ached, refusing to give Sterling's hunters the satisfaction of hearing him scream. "Put me down," Harlan grunted. The words tasted like copper. Zalith didn't slow her pace. "We are not clear of the thermal scanners. If we stop, we die. If you don't stop, I bleed out in 10 minutes anyway." Harlan managed to slap the heavy armor plating on her shoulder. "Put me down, Zay. I know what I'm doing." Reluctantly, she slowed. They reached a small, recessed alcove where a rusted pressure relief valve jutted from the ice. Zalith knelt, lowering him to the wet stone floor with surprising gentleness. Harlan gasped as his back hit the wall. He fumbled in the dark, pulling his tactical flashlight from his vest. The beam clicked on, illuminating the grim reality of his wound. The right side of his parka was saturated, the fabric stiff and heavy with frozen blood. He unzipped the jacket with trembling fingers. "Hold the light," he ordered, his voice tight. Zalith took the flashlight. In the harsh glare, her silver eyes were wide, taking in the jagged tear in his armor and the ruin of flesh beneath. For a creature born to war, she looked uncharacteristically shaken. Harlan reached into a pouch on his rig and pulled out a standard-issue trauma kit. He bypassed the bandages and went straight for the coagulant foam. "It hit an artery," Harlan said, his breath hitching. "The foam won't hold it. Not with my heart rate." He looked up at her. The shadows played across her indigo face, highlighting the dirt, the bruises, and the fierce protective set of her jaw. "Your hands," Harlan said. "What?" "Your hands, Zalith. Take your gloves off." She didn't hesitate. She stripped the heavy tactical gloves from her hands, exposing her long, scarred fingers. "Press them against the wound," Harlan instructed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as a wave of dizziness hit him. "Right against the artery. Don't hold back. Give me everything you've got." Zalith understood. Her biology was a weapon. It could freeze a man's blood in his veins. She placed her bare, freezing hands directly over the gaping wound in his hip. Harlan roared. He couldn't help it. The shock of the absolute Arctic cold hitting his exposed nerves was worse than the impact of the shrapnel. It felt like a knife made of dry ice driving straight into his marrow. His back arched, his head slamming against the stone wall. "Harlan!" Zalith cried out, trying to pull away. "Don't!" he ground out, grabbing her wrists with a desperate iron grip. "Keep it there. Freeze it shut." She pressed harder. The ambient temperature in the alcove plummeted. Frost began to form on the collar of Harlan's jacket. The intense cold penetrated the ruptured blood vessels, forcibly contracting them. The bleeding slowed into a sluggish trickle, and then miraculously it stopped. The blood froze into a dark crimson seal. Harlan's head fell back against the rock. He was panting, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. Zalith kept her hands firmly over the wound, but she leaned in closer. Her silver eyes searched his face. "You are a stubborn old fool," she whispered. Harlan managed a weak, lopsided smile. "You're just figuring that out." She didn't smile back. "Why did you not run when Sterling aimed the weapon? You had the exhaust port. You could have vanished." Harlan looked at the frosted ceiling of the tunnel. He thought of the empty shed. He thought of the 10 years he had spent hiding from his own shadow, punishing himself for 3 seconds of hesitation. He had survived, but he hadn't lived. Not really. A man can only run so far before he forgets what he's running from, Harlan said quietly. He shifted his gaze to her. I ran from a ghost. I'm done running. He reached up his calloused, grease-stained fingers wrapping around her cold forearm. You told me your father sold you out. Harlan continued the gravel in his voice steady and firm. You told me you were fighting for a people who didn't even know they were being betrayed. You had nothing left, say, no throne, no army. And yet, she said softly, I am here. Yeah, Harlan breathed. You're here. He slowly pushed himself up, leaning heavily against the rock wall. The makeshift ice seal on his hip held. It throbbed with a dull, frozen ache, but he could put weight on the leg. Sterling and your father, Harlan said, his mechanic's brain clicking back into gear. They aren't just here to kill us. They were moving heavy equipment. If they're excavating that ancient core tonight, they'll need the primary seismic dampeners offline to crack the deep ice. The core is located beneath Sector 7, Zaleth confirmed. It is a massive cavern. The ancients buried it deep to keep it from the storms. Sector 7 is 2 miles north. Harlan checked his Magnum revolver, snapping the cylinder shut. If Sterling powers up that core to full capacity, the thermal output will melt the permafrost shelf. He'll flood half the mining colonies on this hemisphere and blame it on Cryon sabotage. Zaleth picked up the plasma cutter. The blue blade ignited with a lethal hiss. Then we do not let him power it up. Harlan nodded. He unclipped a high-explosive grenade from his belt and weighed it in his hand. I spent my whole life fixing broken machines, Zay. Let's go break one. The cavern was a cathedral of ice and stolen light. Harlan and Zaleth lay flat on a narrow ridge of blue glacier, looking down into the massive subterranean hollow. The scale of the operation was staggering. Sterling Dynamics had brought down heavy corporate machinery. Massive multi-story drilling rigs, painted in harsh yellow and black, were bolted to the ice floor. Thick, pulsing power cables snaked across the cavern, connecting the drills to a central excavation pit. And in the center of that pit was the core. It wasn't a machine, not in the human sense. It was a monolithic geometric structure of dark, translucent crystal. Deep within its center, a violent, swirling storm of amber light pulsed like a trapped sun. The sheer energy radiating from it made the air in the cavern shimmer with heat waves. By the ancestors, Zaleth breathed beside him. Even she, the heir to the Ice Thrones, had never seen the ancient power with her own eyes. Around the perimeter of the pit, Sterling's heavily armed mercenaries stood guard. Beside them, maintaining an uneasy truce, were rows of elite Cryon warriors in spiked armor. Standing on a raised metal command platform overlooking the crystal monolith were Colonel Sterling and General Vale. The power output is exceeding projections by 400%. Sterling was saying, his voice carrying over the cavern's public address system. He sounded smug, insulated by his wealth and his army. General, with this energy, your people will have the weapons to wipe the colonists off the surface, and my corporation will hold the monopoly on the greatest power source in the galaxy. General Vale, a towering figure of indigo muscle and scars, looked down at the amber light. The cost was heavy, human. The blood of my daughter is on your hands. Sterling didn't even flinch. A tragic casualty of war. Leadership requires sacrifice, General. Up on the ridge, Harlan felt Zaleth go rigid. Her grip on the plasma cutter tightened until the metal groaned. Don't let them bait you, Harlan whispered, putting a hand on her shoulder. We aren't here for revenge. We're here to pull the plug. He pointed to a massive cylindrical structure located behind the main drilling rig. It was venting massive plumes of white steam into the cavern ceiling. That's the primary thermal regulator, Harlan explained. Sterling is using corporate tech to siphon the ancient energy. The core runs hot. The corporate drills run cold. That regulator is the bridge. If I can get to it, I can reverse the coolant flow. I can feed the core's heat directly back into Sterling's machines. An overload, Zaleth realized. A catastrophic one, Harlan confirmed. It'll melt the drills to slag and trigger a structural collapse. The ice ceiling will come down. The core gets buried forever. They have 50 armed men between us and that machine. I only need 30 seconds at the control panel. Harlan looked at her. I'll draw their fire. You take the high ground, keep them pinned. Zaleth shook her head. No, you cannot run with that wound. I will draw the fire. You get to the machine. Harlan started to argue, but she cut him off, her silver eyes blazing with the authority of a queen. I am the Ice Throne, Harlan. These are my people down there. My father corrupted them. It is my duty to face them. She touched his scarred neck. You fix the machine. I will hold the line. Before he could stop her, Zaleth stood up. She didn't sneak down the ridge. She leaped. She landed on the metal roof of a corporate supply rover with a deafening crash, the heavy steel buckling beneath her boots. Every gun in the cavern swung toward her. Vale, her voice roared, echoing off the ancient ice. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. Look upon the daughter you sold. Chaos erupted. Kill her, Sterling screamed, diving behind the command console. The corporate mercenaries opened fire. A storm of kinetic rounds and plasma bolts lit up the cavern. But Zaleth was already moving. She dropped off the rover, sprinting through the maze of crates and power cables. She was a blur of indigo and flashing blue plasma. She didn't attack the Cryon warriors. She targeted the mercenaries. She slid beneath a volley of rifle fire, swinging her heavy cutter. The blade sheared through a mercenary's kinetic armor, sending him crashing into the snow. She grabbed his dropped rifle with her free hand, firing one-handed into a cluster of corporate guards, driving them back. The Cryon warriors hesitated. They recognized her. They looked to General Vale for orders. She is a traitor to our blood, Vale bellowed, drawing a massive two-handed kinetic broadsword. Strike her down. Harlan didn't wait to watch the outcome. While every eye was on the runaway queen, he slipped down the far side of the ridge, moving as fast as his wounded leg would allow. The pain in his hip was blinding, a constant sickening throb that threatened to pull him under. He dragged his right leg, relying on the heavy metal crates for cover. The deafening roar of the firefight covered the sound of his ragged breathing. He reached the base of the primary thermal regulator. It was massive, a three-story tower of pipes, valves, and digital readouts. Harlan pulled himself up the maintenance ladder, his arms doing all the work. He reached the first catwalk and found the main control terminal. It was locked behind a heavy shatterproof casing. He didn't have the passcodes. He didn't need them. Harlan pulled the tungsten wrench from his belt. With a heavy grunt, he smashed the heavy metal head of the wrench into the casing, once, twice. The reinforced glass shattered. He reached inside, grabbing the thick cluster of fiber optic cables connecting the corporate interface to the cooling valves. He didn't hack the system. He ripped the cables out by the roots. Warning sirens immediately blared to life. The cavern was bathed in flashing red emergency lights. Warning, coolant flow disrupted, core temperature rising. A mechanized voice echoed through the cavern. Down on the floor, Colonel Sterling looked up at the regulator tower. He saw the old mechanic, covered in blood and grease, ripping apart his billion-dollar investment. The mechanic, Sterling screamed into his comms. Take him out. Two mercenaries pivoted, aiming their thermal rifles at the catwalk. Before they could pull the triggers, a massive steel crate slammed into them, crushing them against a drill rig. Zaleth stood 20 feet away, her breathing heavy, the plasma cutter humming in her hand. She had thrown the 2-ton crate like a baseball. Harlan, how much longer? She yelled. I have to manually invert the intake valve. Harlan shouted back, his hands a blur, as he stripped wires and rerouted the massive power conduits. Keep them off me! A towering shadow fell over Zaleth. General Vale stepped into her path, his massive broadsword resting on his shoulder. He looked at his daughter, his eyes cold and devoid of any paternal warmth. You bring a human mechanic to destroy our salvation, Vale sneered. You are weak, Zaleth. You let their fragility infect you. Zaleth raised her plasma cutter, the blue light reflecting in her silver eyes. She looked at her father, the man who had taught her to hold a blade, the man who had ordered her death. You sold our honor for corporate machines, father, she said, her voice steady. There is no salvation in this pit, only greed. With a roar, Vale charged. He swung the broadsword in a devastating horizontal arc that would have cut a rover in half. Zaleth ducked the blade, whistling inches over her head. She thrust upward with the plasma cutter, aiming not for flesh, but for the joint of his heavy armor. The blue blade melted the interlocking plates of his shoulder guard, forcing him to drop his guard. They clashed in a shower of sparks and ice. It was a brutal, intimate fight. The strength of the old general against the speed and righteous fury of his daughter. Up on the catwalk, Harlan found the manual override wheel for the intake valve. It was rusted tight from the ambient moisture. He grabbed the wheel with both hands and pulled. His boots slipped on the grated metal. Pain ripped through his hip, dropping him to his knees. The wheel didn't budge. Warning, core temperature at critical mass. Meltdown imminent. The amber light from the ancient crystal was no longer pulsing. It was blinding a solid, terrifying wall of heat that began to melt the permafrost walls of the cavern. Chunks of ice the size of houses began to crash down from the ceiling. Harlan dragged himself back up to the wheel. 3 seconds, he thought. No hesitation. He gripped the cold steel wheel. He thought of the 19-year-old kid in the desert. He thought of the empty shed. He thought of the Cryon Queen who had wrapped him in darknesses and kept his heart beating. With a guttural primal roar, Harlan threw his entire body weight backward, twisting his torso with agonizing force. The rust cracked. The wheel gave way, spinning rapidly to the left. Deep within the machine, a massive metallic clank echoed. The cooling system reversed. Instead of pulling heat away from the core, the machine slammed the superheated exhaust directly back into the corporate drills. The massive yellow rig shrieked as the metal began to warp and melt under the impossible heat. "No!" Sterling screamed from his platform. He drew his hand cannon and fired wildly at the catwalk. A bullet clipped Harlan's shoulder, spinning him around. He fell flat onto the metal grating, his magnum revolver clattering out of his hand. Sterling didn't stop. He abandoned the command console, sprinting toward the ladder of the regulator tower, his face twisted in a mask of pure desperation. He couldn't let his prize be destroyed. Down below, Zalith parried a heavy overhead strike from her father. The force of the blow drove her to one knee. Vale raised his sword for the killing blow. "Yield, girl," Vale roared over the sound of the collapsing cavern. Zalith looked up at him. She saw the amber light of the overloading core reflecting in his eyes. She didn't yield. She dropped her plasma cutter, stepped inside his guard, and drove her armored fist directly into his wounded shoulder joint. Vale dropped the sword with a grunt of pain. Before he could recover, Zalith grabbed the heavy chest plate of his armor and hurled him backward. He crashed into a snowbank, sliding perilously close to the edge of the central pit where the heat was now unbearable. She didn't finish him. She turned and ran for the regulator tower. Harlan was struggling to reach his fallen revolver. Sterling crested the top of the ladder, his hand cannon raised, aiming down at the wounded mechanic. "You ruined everything, old man," Sterling spat. Before Sterling could pull the trigger, a massive indigo hand reached up from the ladder behind him, grabbing the back of his hazard suit. Sterling was ripped backwards, screaming as he was thrown off of the catwalk. He plummeted 3 stories, crashing into the melting ruins of his own command platform. He didn't get up. Zalith vaulted over the railing, dropping to her knees beside Harlan. "It's done." Harlan coughed, blood trickling from his lips. He pointed to the collapsing drills. "The whole ceiling is coming down. We have to go." The cavern was tearing itself apart. The ancient core, overloaded by the corporate tech, was releasing a localized seismic wave. Massive fissures cracked through the glacier. Zalith hauled Harlan to his feet, throwing his arm over her shoulder. They didn't go back the way they came. They moved toward the heavy corporate freight elevator embedded in the far wall of the ice. Behind them, General Vale staggered to his feet. He looked at the collapsing cavern, the melting drills, and the fleeing figure of his daughter, holding up the human. He finally realized the magnitude of his failure. He had brought the storm down on his own head. He didn't run. He picked up his broadsword, turned toward the blinding light of the overloading core, and stood his ground as the cavern ceiling collapsed upon him. Harlan and Zalith reached the freight elevator. Zalith smashed the emergency ascent button. The heavy metal doors slammed shut just as a blinding wave of amber fire swept across the cavern floor, vaporizing everything in its path. The elevator shot upward, groaning under the seismic stress of the collapsing earth. Harlan leaned against the wall, sliding down to a sitting position. His breathing was shallow. He looked at his hands. They were covered in blood, grease, and frost, but they weren't shaking. He looked up at Zalith. She was staring at the metal doors, the reflection of the emergency lights painting her face in shades of crimson and shadow. She had lost her father. She had lost her army. She had lost her claim to the ice thrones. "Zay," Harlan rasped. She looked down at him. "We have nowhere to go," he said. "Outpost Echo is gone. Your people think you're a traitor." Zalith knelt beside him. She reached out her cool fingers, gently wiping the grime from his scarred cheek. We have nowhere to go, she agreed, her voice a soft, melodic hum that cut through the mechanical grinding of the elevator. So we will go everywhere else. She pressed her forehead against his. The deep, absolute cold of her skin met the feverish heat of his wounded body. A perfect balance. A perfect exchange. I see you, Harlan Vance, she whispered. Harlan closed his eyes, leaning into the cold. I see you, Zalith. The elevator broke the surface opening into the howling, endless white of the Tartarus 9 storms. They stepped out into the wind, two broken outcasts with nothing left in the universe but each other, and walked away from the wreckage of their pasts. Now, 5 years later, the wind still screamed on Tartarus 9, but it didn't sound so angry anymore. Far beyond the corporate mining grids, deep in the unmapped territories of the western glaciers, a small plume of gray smoke rose from the chimney of a reinforced subterranean cabin. Inside it was warm. The smell of cedar wood, roasted meat, and motor oil filled the air. Harlan Vance stood at a heavy wooden table, carefully filing the sear on a hunting rifle. He was 67 now. His hair was completely silver, his face lined with the deep canyons of a hard life. The plasma scars on his neck were still there, but they had faded, blending into the weathered topography of his skin. He moved the metal file with slow, deliberate precision. He didn't wear a brace on his wrist anymore. His hands were as steady as bedrock. The heavy insulated door of the cabin hissed open, letting in a swirl of loose snow and a blast of Arctic air. Zalith stepped inside, kicking the snow from her heavy boots. She carried a massive, freshly dressed snow elk over one shoulder. She dropped the heavy carcass onto a tarp in the corner with a dull thud. She looked older, too. The brutal edges of the royal warrior had softened, replaced by the quiet, powerful grace of a survivor who had found her peace. She wore a heavy fur-lined parka over a simple canvas shirt. She pulled off her gloves and walked over to the cast-iron stove in the center of the room. She picked up a battered enamel pot and poured a thick, steaming black liquid into a ceramic mug. She walked over to the workbench and leaned against it, holding the mug out to Harlan. Harlan stopped filing. He looked at the mug. He looked at her. I still don't know why you drink that engine sludge, Harlan said, a low, gravelly chuckle rumbling in his chest. Zalith took a slow, deliberate sip. She didn't wince. Over 5 years, she had forced herself to acquire the taste. It was a stubborn point of pride. It keeps me moving, old man, she replied, her silver eyes crinkling at the corners. She set the mug down and stepped closer to him. She reached out her cool fingers, tracing the line of his jaw. The touch was familiar, grounding, and necessary. Harlan leaned into her hand, closing his eyes for a brief second. The ghost of the young soldier in the desert hadn't visited him in years. The empty freezing shed was a lifetime away. Zalith looked at the glowing embers in the stove, then back to Harlan. A faint, knowing smile touched her blue lips. The fire is dying down, she said softly, her melodic voice dropping to a quiet hum. Harlan set the metal file on the table. He turned to face her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling the imposing, beautiful alien warrior against his chest. Don't worry, Harlan said, his voice a steady, comforting anchor in the quiet cabin. The bed is warm.